There's a strange absurdity to modern London. It's a city designed to get people moving. Hundreds of underground stations, thousands of buses, bridges, tunnels, maps and apps, all telling you how to get from here to there. But the moment you need one of the most basic things a city can provide, the whole thing can become surprisingly difficult. Like looking for a loo, but there isn't one. Or maybe there is one, but it's behind the ticket barriers, which means you need to buy a ticket. But maybe it isn't open after all. But if it is open, it might need coins. Although maybe it's one of those refurbished ones that only takes cards. Well, that's easier. But does it take Amex? Maybe there's another toilet somewhere nearby. There's probably an app that tells you. Another app. There's something almost impressive about the way London makes you feel you're the only person who has this problem, as if you should have planned better, downloaded the right app, carried the right change, known the right station. But of course it isn't really a private problem at all. And whether they're there, whether they're open, whether they're easy to find, and whether you're actually allowed to use them, changes how confidently people can move through a city. Who can stay out longer? Who has to plan ahead? Who can travel easily? And who starts avoiding certain journeys altogether? Once you start looking, you start to see traces of them everywhere. Locked stairways, old signs, blocked entrances, iron railings around steps that lead below the pavement. The remains of old public toilets, built into streets, stations, and busy corners all over London. And in a city of around 9 million people, there's no shortage of full bladders. So what happened to London's loos? One of the earliest public toilets in London was not a grand building at all. It stood in what was then Rose Street, now Manette Street, in Soho, a modest little structure dating from around 1849. At the time, it was known as a public necessary rather than a convenience. But it was at the Great Exhibition of 1851 that the idea was tested on a much larger scale. Hyde Park became a showcase of modern life. Visitors came to see the great glass building, the ironwork, the machines, the inventions, and all the confidence of the industrial age. But a crowd that large brought a much simpler problem with it. George Jennings provided flushing toilets for the exhibition, and they were used on a huge scale. But the arrangement was not quite as simple as public toilets for everyone. While the urinals provided for men were free, Jennings' flushing toilets, known as monkey closets, cost a penny to use. This is believed to be the origin of the phrase, to spend a penny. But a penny was prohibitive for many people, so there was also a cheaper alternative, at a halfpenny. These were called urinettes, though in practice they were little more than a hole in the ground. So the exhibition's toilets didn't just provide relief, they made money. Over the course of the exhibition, they were used more than 800,000 times and raised over £2,000, most of it from women who had no free alternative. The Great Exhibition proved that the public toilet could work as a piece of engineering, a public service, and as a small business. And almost immediately, the question was where to put the next ones. Over the next few decades, public toilets became part of the fabric of London. Not everywhere, and not equally, but in places where the city was busiest, in railway stations, in parks, on high streets, and at crowded junctions. Many of them were built underground. Below the pavement, there might be glazed tiles, cubicles, mirrors, attendance booths, and all the practical machinery that made the place work. It needed water, drains, ventilation, and lighting. It needed cleaning, repairs, and maintenance. But from the street, all you usually saw was a polite little entrance. Railings, steps, a lamp, maybe a sign, just enough architecture to announce that something useful was down there, while remaining vague about exactly what. It was a very London sort of arrangement. Put the toilet exactly where people needed it, but not quite where anyone had to look at it. By the end of the Victorian period, public toilets could be found in the working parts of the city. If London was going to move people around, it also had to provide for the bodies being moved. And the underground toilet became one of those bits of street furniture that people stopped noticing because it was doing its job. But even at its height, this network was never as straightforwardly public as it looked. A public convenience sounds brilliantly simple, public and convenient. Except, of course, they weren't always either. A public toilet might be built by a public authority in a public place for public use, but once you got to the entrance, the public part often became more complicated. There might be a charge, and while spending a penny sounds quaint, if you needed a penny and didn't have one, the convenience stopped being so convenient. There might be opening hours too. The toilet could be there, but still not be available when you needed it. And if there was a free provision at all, it tended to be the men's urinal. Everything else was more conditional, and those conditions fell very unevenly. Around 1900, St Pancras Vestry proposed a women's public toilet near Park Street and Camden High Street, a busy area of traffic, shops, workers and passing crowds. There was already a convenience for men nearby, but when one for women was proposed, there were plenty of objections. Some questioned the need in that location, arguing that many of the women passing through the area lived locally, so could just go home. Some claimed it would devalue nearby property, and other objections seem to have been less about the details and more about the idea of having a women's toilet in the street at all. A wooden model of the proposed toilet was placed in the street to test the site. It was hit dozens of times by passing vehicles, and some suspected, not always accidentally. But thousands of women and girls pass through places like Camden every day, on their way to shops, stations and workplaces. For them, this was not just a symbolic problem, it was also a practical limitation on how they could go about their day. Where women's toilets did exist, they were more often housed in private or semi-private places like department stores and restaurants. And while those places may have helped, they weren't the same as public toilets in the street. They came with assumptions that you were a customer, that you looked like you belonged and could afford to be there, and that the building was open when you needed it. The fight for women's toilets became a fight about whether the city would accommodate the ordinary practical needs of women who were part of it. There was another condition attached to London's public toilets, though, and this one was written into the law. From the Victorian period, public health legislation gave local authorities powers to provide public toilets, but those powers were generally discretionary. Councils could provide them, but they didn't necessarily have to. That distinction continued into the 20th century. The Public Health Act 1936 said a local authority may provide public sanitary conveniences in proper and convenient situations. May, not must. It meant public toilets were recognised by law as something councils could build and operate, but not as something they had to do. The same section also allowed councils to charge for the use of water closets, effectively the cubicles, but not for the urinals. So the old imbalance didn't just survive as custom, it was now built into the legal framework. Men often had a free option, women usually didn't, and even then providing any service at all was still optional. So public toilets depended on local decisions, local money, local priorities, and a local willingness to accommodate them. The word may in the legislation helped London build public toilets, but later that same word would help London lose them again. Public toilets were useful, but they were also awkward things to keep open. They needed cleaning, they needed repairs, they needed attendants, or at least someone responsible for them. They needed lights that worked, drains that cleared, and locks that opened and closed. Underground toilets in particular had their own problems. These could be difficult to access, difficult to supervise, and expensive to maintain. So a public toilet that closed for repairs might simply never reopen. The sign could come down, the stairs could be gated. The toilet might be sold, or demolished, or just left to decay under the pavement. This wasn't the result of one grand policy. Public toilets were more often the victim of council budget constraints, and their closure was often just the easiest response to maintenance problems, complaints, staffing costs, and sometimes vandalism. And with public toilets being something councils may provide, rather than must provide, closure was always easier than replacement. By the early 20th century, the old network had thinned out dramatically. Some toilets survived, mostly in stations, parks and markets. Some were refurbished, but many more became blocked stairs and padlocked doors. Recent figures suggest the pattern has continued. In the decade after 2013, London councils that responded to Freedom of Information requests had closed far more public toilets than they had opened. When a public toilet closes, the need doesn't go away. It just moves somewhere else, to a cafe, a pub or a department store, or a fast food restaurant with a door entry code printed at the bottom of a receipt. But many of London's old toilets didn't vanish from the streets completely. They just became something else. Under an ornate iron structure in Foley Street, Fitzrovia, steps still lead down below the street as they always did. Except beneath the pavement, there's no longer a gents' public toilet. This is now a coffee shop. The old white tiles survive. Even the urinals survive, though thoroughly cleaned up, I understand. It's both charming and unsettling, and very modern London. Once you notice one of these places, you start to notice a pattern. Across London, old public toilets have become cafes, bars, galleries and kiosks. In one sense, this isn't such a bad thing. These conversions can rescue old structures that might otherwise have been sealed up, demolished, or left to rot. But it's also a peculiar kind of survival. The architecture remains, but the public function has gone. And it no longer solves the problem it was built for. These old loos haven't vanished exactly. They've become curiosities. The old public toilet network became more of a patchwork. There are still public toilets in London, often in parks, stations, museums and shopping centres. Some are clearly signposted, some a little more elusive. But increasingly, finding a toilet in public means finding something that isn't quite a public toilet at all. A cafe, a pub, or a supermarket. A hotel lobby, if you look confident enough. There are maps and apps to help you find them. There are community toilet schemes, where businesses agree to let the public use their loos. And all of this can be very useful. But it's not quite the same thing as a city saying, here is a public toilet, in a public space, for public use. London hasn't lost the need, but it has outsourced the answer into businesses, apps, receipts, barriers, and small acts of negotiation, which is fine unless you're the person who can't negotiate. And then the missing toilet stops being just a minor inconvenience. There are signs that London has started to notice the problem again, and to see public toilets as infrastructure. Not, can this little room pay for itself, but what does the city lose when it isn't there? There have been calls for clearer maps, better signage, and more consistent provision. There are still councils, transport bodies, and campaigners trying to improve things. There are also small physical signs of a different approach. In Maida Vale, a new public toilet has been built above ground rather than hidden beneath it. It's modest, but deliberate. A small building, placed where people can actually see it, with accessible cubicles and an architecture that doesn't seem embarrassed by what it is. Which feels surprisingly radical, not because it's grand, but because it's visible and useful. The old London loos were never perfect, but they did recognise something important. that a city isn't only streets, trains, offices, shops and monuments. It's also people. So perhaps the question isn't whether London should bring back its old lost loos. It's whether London can remember why it built them in the first place.